the CD32, a great machine and one that got a few compilation CDs full of games that were already on the Amiga, unlike what we're going to be looking at today. So let's check out OverKill and Lunacy. And welcome to Goldfish on Games. Both titles were made by TWB in 1993, with OverKill also getting an A1200 big box release, but Lunacy, it was only ever sold on this CD. And this was published by Mindscape, who had this cardboard box for their CD32 releases. They're not as durable as regular jewel cases, but I am a sucker for unique packaging. And hidden inside this flap we find a manual that, well, it didn't really need to dedicate too many pages to explaining these games. And under the registration flap we find the CD itself. On booting the game, we get this attractive if basic menu that lets us select between the two games. There's no intro, no CD music, both games come to a total of 4.5 megabytes. So if you're looking for a game that pushes the CD medium, as well as the CD32 itself, then these are not it. But amazingly, if I was to give a one-line review for this, it would be better than you might expect. So let's start off with a bit of OverKill. And much like the selection menu, this isn't wasting your time with its presentation. A simple title screen, and then you go on to select 1 or 2 player modes. Cutting to the chase, this is very much the answer to, what if we made Defender, but with 90s sensibilities? From the large spaceship that drops us off at the start, to the detailed backgrounds with more layers of parallax scrolling going on than you can count. As well as lots of enemies and other things going on at the same time. And obviously, you have to have an over-the-top death sequence. But if you scratch away a bit at that surface detail, what you find is actually a decent enough game that has more changes and its own ideas than it might first appear. The more obvious one is the weapon upgrades. And the further you make it into the game, you can find additional weapons as well. They still drain, so you have to be careful with your use, or you can just keep firing them all the time and hope that you might find a refill that will keep them going a little bit longer. Now don't worry if you happen to pick up a different weapon to what you're currently using, as it won't replace it. Instead, it will bank it to be the next weapon used, which is a feature that I greatly appreciate. This does have the side effect of making our starting weapon feel a little bit weaker than the core one in Defender, as it doesn't travel quite as far, so you end up needing to be a bit closer to the enemies than you might want to. And that issue with being too close to them also affects the waves, as a couple of times I have had it spawn in baddies right on top of me, so it's been almost impossible to avoid them. Now there is a tool that can help you out in these situations, that is if you have time to activate it, and that is the shield, as you can toggle it on and off for a limited amount of time. And surprisingly, with the rest of the effects that this game has, it doesn't give you much feedback when it's running, and you'll only know how much longer you have left by looking at the HUD, which most of the time would be a bit of a risk due to how fast things can get. And it doesn't help that the bar is quite small considering how glanceable you want it. It also has a bit of a problem that if you play this on real hardware on a CRT TV, then where they're placed means that they can be well into the overscan area of most TVs, and thus it's vanished off the side. You might have noticed that when a level starts, a ship will fly by and drop down some support troops. Their goal is to take out the crystals that you can see along the bottom of some of the maps, and if they manage to destroy one, then you'll get a nice little message. But they've only brought enough equipment to take out a few of them, so it's our job to keep them stocked up, and act as a transport service for them, as they'll jump in the air to try and grab a ride. Now this is where the game differs from Defender, as it's when the enemies go to collect these trilithium crystals that they'll mutate. They don't directly go after our troopers. Now if you're good enough, then you can pretty much ignore all of these, as you just need to take out the enemy waves to finish a level. And completing a level shows us another big change, as we get to select where we play next. Not that it really means much, as you'll still need to complete all the levels to be able to finish the game, but it is at least nice to appear to have some level of freedom. As you can imagine, as you go on, new monsters will show up, and even bigger monsters will show up in some of the waves, that will take far more shots to take down. And you might have to deal with them in a far more cautious manner. Thankfully, you can see them on the nicely detailed radar, but running into them at speed is always a danger, as well as running into their bullets. To be honest, all of this makes this a bit of a difficult game to look at, as Defender was the basis of a number of very well done PD games. And in many ways, this doesn't really do anything completely original or new with the concept. But it has been done to a great standard. It's colourful, with detailed graphics and some nice effects going on. But was it worth getting a CD32 or an Amiga 1200 for? No, not really. But will you have a lot of fun if you play it? Yes, very much so. So let's move on to that second game, Lunacy. Get the pun? That opens up with a bit more of an interesting title screen, even if that was a slightly low bar to clear. And then it goes on to give us a few options. Ooh, fancy. Now mostly this is to enter a level code or to quit back to the main menu, but when we get into the game we find it's a horizontal shooter, with possibly the worst looking ship I have ever seen in this style of game. It's just a flying saucer. Was that really the best they could do? And it's also extremely sluggish. Or at least to start with, as this has a Project X Gradius style upgrade system, and taking out waves of baddies will drop these capsules. That first time I played it, I actively avoided, as they looked like a small missile that was coming for me. So you should avoid it, right? Well, if you do collect them, you'll find that it'll fill up the bar at the top of the screen, with the speed icon being the second option. And after a few upgrades, things do feel much better. But in getting to that point, you start to notice something else. The background. It's a simple, repeating thing. It's like something out of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. And this will remain for the entirety of the level. There are no walls, no interesting backgrounds, or installations for you to try and fly around. So for once you don't have to worry about colliding with the ground or the ceiling, but this is just a simple background to give you a sense of movement. There's nothing to it. Now, I think this is where we can start to see why many people believe that this was just included free on this collection. But you know what? I think this is actually a bit more interesting than that, as there's this health system that once it's gone is game over. But you can top it up with the first option in the upgrades. So you have this interesting risk-reward system going on. Do you push for the later upgrades that might help you take out ships easier? Or do you try and top up your energy quickly? What I would suggest at least is going for a few of the weapon upgrades first. The pulse guns do get much better even with a single upgrade, but getting the flame or the plasma is a really good option. The side shots, while very weak, can help you out with some of those baddies that like to do loop-the-loops around you. Now on the subject of baddies, most are simple ships or missiles. They're not particularly creative. but thankfully they aren't the typical Euro shooter bullet sponges that I've come to know and hate. But they do have quite the range of paths and patterns that they'll use to show up in. Enemies will come in from the front, or from the behind, or from the top or bottom. They just appear everywhere, particularly when you're trying to deal with the asteroids. The game consists of 4 levels in total, which doesn't sound like a lot, but they are quite long and do get very difficult, meaning this isn't going to be an easy game to finish. Now, to aid you in this, there's a password system. That is, if you manage to finish a level at all. And the passwords do also include the weapons that you've collected so far, which is a surprisingly nice thing for them to do. Now, normally I'd expect you to start with absolutely nothing and have to work your way back up again. And as you might imagine, the levels do get harder as you go on, even if they still do have that basic scrolling background. It does change, but that's the absolute minimum that you'd expect. Now, I can see why this never got released on its own. It's fine enough as a basic shooter, but in 1993, even if it was a budget release, it would have had to go up against stuff like Project X and its special edition that was on sale at a budget price at the time. And it at least had music when you played. This doesn't even have that. And really, this is where that CD medium really should have been used, as they could have put some great music on it and had it playing in the background while you're shooting. So it remains a bit of a wasted opportunity if you ask me. But I do have to say, I did actually enjoy playing this. It's difficult, but not game-breakingly so, looking at you again, Project X. And the use of energy and the upgrade system works really well together. Now, it could have done with being a bit more creative with having more interesting levels and enemies, but at least the paths that they used were far more interesting than I was expecting, and do keep you on your fingers. Now, this isn't a classic or a hidden gem by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it deserves a little bit better than the reputation that it's gotten. And with that, I feel we're at the end of this episode. Now, did you have this collection back in the day, or do you only know it by its reputation? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, I've been the Goldfish, that was much flying and shooting, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, then there's a few buttons that will let me know. And if you'd like more Amiga or CD32 content, and who wouldn't, then there are 2 videos on the screen right now that you can check out. Or if you'd like to be informed of new releases, because I do new Amiga videos all the time, then you can try subscribing.